minister made a threat that alarmed even longtime Korea watchers.
This could probably mean the strongest hydrogen bomb test over the Pacific.
Donald Trump said he would totally destroy North Korea, a sovereign state.
Prepare for North Korea to detonate a nuclear device above ground.
The foreign minister is very well aware of the intentions of our supreme leader, so I think you should take his words literally.
Trump raised some eyebrows by tweeting this, quote, "I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with little Rocket Man." Then he added, "Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be."
The U.S. Air Force preparing to put its nuclear-armed B-52 bombers on alert for the first time since the end of the Cold War as tensions escalate with North Korea.
If you look at it from the North Korean perspective, they have always believed that nuclear weapons would be the key to peace and stability in this region by preventing the United States from, in their view, bullying them. They feel if they can prove they have an effective nuclear deterrent, then perhaps the U.S. will try to talk instead of trying to impose sanctions and making military threats. But the real fear and the growing fear is that if North Korea actually goes through with this kind of a nuclear test, which does seem increasingly likely, the results and the response from the United States, unknown.
Flying into the North Korean capital, life on the surface seems normal. Beneath the surface, it's anything but. Overseas North Korean workers are being sent home in droves, their jobs eliminated by UN sanctions. The U.S. calls it punishment for an illegal, dangerous nuclear program. North Korea calls it evil, an economic blockade. On my 16th trip to Pyongyang, I still see signs of growth, plenty of traffic, construction, a steady flow of electricity, keeping the growing skyline bright. But the prospects of a peaceful resolution to the nuclear standoff with the U.S. seem to be growing darker by the day. At North Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we asked to meet with a senior diplomat. Lee Yong-pil agrees to talk, but the mood is tense. His anger at the U.S. palpable.
Donald Trump said he would totally destroy North Korea, a sovereign state.
He's referring to the U.S. president's fiery speech at the UN last month when he personally insulted a fellow head of state.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un fired back, calling President Trump's behavior mentally deranged. North Korea's foreign minister made a threat that alarmed even longtime Korea watchers.
This could probably mean the strongest hydrogen bomb test over the Pacific Ocean.
Some analysts have accused North Korea of bluster, saying they haven't yet achieved full nuclear capability. And if they go to war, they risk total destruction. But the North Koreans warn the U.S. not to underestimate their resolve and their growing arsenal.
Should the world prepare for North Korea to detonate a nuclear device above ground?
The foreign minister is very well aware of the intentions of our supreme leader, so I think you should take his words literally.
U.S. and North Korean officials tell CNN diplomacy has broken down, pushing two nuclear powers dangerously close to military conflict.
The U.S. is talking about a military option and even practicing military moves. They're pressuring us on all fronts with sanctions. If you think this will lead to diplomacy, you're deeply mistaken.
So then I ask, what needs to happen for diplomacy to resume?
The US needs to understand our new strategic power and fundamentally eliminate its hostile policy towards the DPRK.
He says North Korea's leader is following through on a pledge to reach a nuclear balance of power with the U.S., which they say will lead to peace and stability. Even as many around the world worry, the end result could be the exact opposite.
If North Korea were to go through with this atmospheric thermonuclear test, it would be the first the world has seen in nearly 4 decades, since China did it back in 1980. But again, North Korean officials here reiterated this would only be a test to improve their technical knowledge, to send a message that they have this nuclear deterrent. They would not consider this an act of war. Again, in their view, nuclear weapons will guarantee peace, a view counterintuitive to much of the rest of the world who really worry what is going to happen. And then, of course, Michael and Amber, the big question here, timing with President Trump's visit to
A Fox News alert, the U.S. Air Force preparing to put its nuclear-armed B-52 bombers on alert for the first time since the end of the Cold War as tensions escalate with North Korea.
Yeah, let's get right to Ryan Chilcote live in London with the very latest this morning. Ryan.
That's right. The Air Force is taking steps to make sure that its fleet of about 76 B-52s can be ready to fly at a moment's notice. That's according to the Air Force's Chief of Staff. His name is General David Goldfein, and he has told Defense One, a national security website, that the U.S. is renovating Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. That's where about half of our B-52s are based. And he said that the infrastructure there is being prepared so that if there is such an order for that 24 hours readiness, that they can make good on it. Meanwhile, President Trump, appearing on Fox Business News this weekend, said that while he's still hopeful that China could put that pressure on Kim Jong-un to change course, the U.S. is prepared to do whatever it takes.
We're prepared for anything. We are so prepared like you wouldn't believe. You would be shocked to see how totally prepared we are.
On the diplomatic front, former President Jimmy Carter said he's ready to help. Jimmy Carter went to North Korea in 1994 under the Clinton administration for talks. He's told General McMaster, that's President Trump's national security advisor, that he's prepared to go should they want him to.
On North Korea. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson admitting there is direct communication between the U.S. and Kim Jong-un's regime, raising the possibility of diplomatic talks with Pyongyang amid the heightened nuclear tensions. This after he met with Chinese leaders yesterday in Beijing. But you know, today, President Trump raised some eyebrows by tweeting this, quote, "I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with little rocket man." Then he added, "Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done." Judy Miller, adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist and Fox News contributor, joins us now. So, Judy, it seems the president is contradicting his Secretary of State. So what are you to make of this?
Well, you know, Eric, with Donald Trump, it's always hard to tell. But rather than leap to conclusions, let me posit a kind of benign explanation, which is perhaps Donald Trump is sending out deliberately mixed messages. Perhaps he wants to be the bad cop and let Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, who's been trying to get these back-channel talks going, and by the way, something seems to be going, as he himself said, so that you have a yin-yang, good cop, bad cop. That's the positive or the benign explanation. There are several other competing explanations. One is that Secretary Tillerson, whom everyone has been rumored to be on the way out for a long time, is now getting the Tom Price treatment, the humiliation, the not-so-subtle tweet push from the president, softened by the blow of wonderful Secretary of State. But it could also be that Donald Trump has just been spending too much time at the 19th hole of his golf course. I mean, we really don't know because it's President Trump.
Well, let's say it's the first explanation, which in some ways seems
right.
it seems to make sense, because here you have Tillerson and Beijing meeting with the leaders, and you got the president. It's like the guy, you know, behind you saying, you know, if you don't work something out, you know, I got the big baseball bat. And we have a tweet from the State Department, Heather Nauert, today, which says that basically this is a message, it seems, directly to Kim Jong-un. It says diplomatic channels are open, but they won't be forever. So that's not a subtle message to, you know, stop your behavior and sit down and perhaps talk.
It's not a subtle message, Eric, and we have seen these mixed messages before. Remember Secretary of Defense Mattis saying that we have, quote, military options available to us. No one seems to know what those might be that wouldn't harm the people of South Korea or endanger our troops in South Korea or Japan. But the problem with North Korea is, and here I have to give President Trump a break, he inherited this mess from a succession of Republican and Democratic presidents who have tried to solve the Korea problem and haven't been able to do so. And we have a young, brash, 33-year-old dictator who's racing ahead in his military program to try and get a weapon that the United States will have to pay attention to as an instrument of regime survival. So let's just hope that those who say that Mr. Kim is actually intent on self-preservation as opposed to suicide, let's just hope they're right. But let's stand back also and ignore for the moment the president's tweets and look at what's happening on the ground. At long last, there seem to be some back-channel talks going on. This would be a good thing because, as Rex Tillerson said, everyone, and I assume he means the president in that as well, needs to lower the temperature a bit.
But, you know, Judy, the talks, and there is a point you talked about the president inheriting this. I mean, he just had a tweet within the last hour. Expressing that exact situation. This is what he says. He says, being nice to Rocket Man hasn't worked in 25 years. Why would it work now? Clinton failed, Bush failed, and Obama failed. And he adds ominously, I won't fail. I mean, look, you had the six-party talks. 1994, the oil for food deal with the Clinton administration, in which they took a lot of oil and money and totally lied and continued their program. And even President George W. Bush, as a sign of generosity, perhaps, took them off the State Department list of terrorism, sponsors of terrorism, and look what we got. So doesn't the president have a point, absent, potential war?
I think the president does have a point on this. Nobody knows how to handle North Korea. And if the president is sending mixed messages deliberately, then I think this message, Eric, and I hope you'll agree with me on this, is aimed just as much at China as it would be at North Korea. Because China, I continue to believe, is enormously influential in terms of what Mr. Kim decides to do. Now, I'm not saying that the Chinese can tell the North Koreans what to do. Clearly, they don't seem to have that ability. But they can make life very painful should they choose to do so.
Well, do you think they've made
Kim Jong-un and his regime?
Do you think they've made it painful enough? I mean, they have taken some steps. We saw that at the UN 2 weeks ago. You know, they're going to cut off the banks that do business with North Korea. They're shutting down North Korean companies. They're apparently doing something with the oil to stop some of the oil trade, 30% or so, but not 100%. Do you think Beijing can do, clearly they can do more. How do we get them to do that?
Well, perhaps you get their attention by scaring them to death and making them think that President Trump is truly capable of going down the military path.
Do you think Tillerson mentioned that?
Actually scare them into.
Do you think Tillerson, I mean, that's the type of conversation he had yesterday with Chinese leaders saying, you know, he's sitting there saying, look, the boss is tweeting this stuff. This is what he thinks. You know, if you can read lips between them, between President Xi and Mr. Tillerson right there, there he is. He looks over and goes, he's tweeting. This is what he really believes. You got to really put the screws onto Kim Jong-un. If you don't do something, pal, you're really in trouble.
You need both. You need Kim Jong-un to decide that the price for his nuclearization and missile program is too high, and you need China to determine that the price in terms of its relationship with the United States is too high if it lets Kim Jong-un continue down this path. This is a truly difficult foreign policy challenge, and I tend to give the president more leeway and be less judgmental on this issue than I am on many others years precisely because of what we've been talking about, the failure of every other administration to change North Korea's calculus and thinking.
And finally, I mean, what if that doesn't work? I mean, look, Kim supposedly ordered the murder of his half-brother and his uncle because they were sympathetic to the Chinese point of view, it is said.
Well, it's at that moment that I'm glad that I'm a humble or not so humble journalist and don't have to make the very difficult decision about what President Trump will decide to do.
We will be waiting and watching and certainly hope this can be solved in a peaceful manner. Judy Miller.
Full-blown conflict would be devastating for the residents of both South and North Korea. If you think back to the mid-1990s, when then-President Clinton was thinking about the possibility of so-called surgical strikes in an effort to take out North Korea's developing WMD capability, its fledgling nuclear program, and its biological and chemical weapons stockpiles. The best advice from Clinton's military advisors suggested that in the best-case scenario, 1 million people would die, civilians and soldiers. The 10 million residents of Seoul who are within the crosshairs of North Korea's conventional artillery batteries would suffer appalling casualties. That was, the best part of 16 years ago. We now have, of course, a North Korea that is much more well-equipped militarily. Even though their conventional forces are somewhat antiquated, they can do a lot of damage. 1 million men under arms who could be deployed into South Korea, a state which has potentially as many as 30 nuclear devices that could be used, as well as those substantial conventional and non-conventional stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons. So it would be catastrophic. And that's why seasoned military advisors like Mattis and McMaster are, I think in private, telling the President that the military option is not really, certainly it's not a first choice, it is a last choice. The basic reality is, if a conflict were to take place, a full-blown conflict, undoubtedly the United States, with its South Korean ally, would prevail. And North Korea cannot win this conflict. And that's what has, in the past, deterred it from taking these sorts of provocative steps. The North Korean leadership may be a leadership that values or appreciates the importance of taking risks, but it is still rational. China, of course, has its own treaty relationship with North Korea, agreed in 1961. China, I think, would worry that a conflict would create a security vacuum north of the DMZ that would be filled by the United States and its South Korean ally, posing a security risk to China. The Chinese have already, we know, made contingency plans to deal with such an eventuality. They would, I think, feel compelled in the event of a crisis to intervene to protect their own strategic space. Nobody, I think, wants conflict. The North Koreans certainly don't, because it would involve potentially the destruction of the regime. The Americans don't, at least as a means of dealing with this current crisis. But there is the very real risk that, against their better intentions.
If you look at it from the North Korean perspective, they have always believed that nuclear weapons would be the key to peace and stability in this region by preventing the United States from, in their view, bullying.
The minister made a threat that alarmed even longtime Korea watchers.
This could probably mean the strongest hydrogen bomb test over the Pacific.
Donald Trump said he would totally destroy North Korea, a sovereign state.
Prepare for North Korea to detonate a nuclear device above ground.
The foreign minister is very...
B-52 bombers on alert for the first time since the end of the Cold War as tensions escalate with North Korea.
actions of our supreme leader. So I think you should take his words literally.
President Trump raised some eyebrows by tweeting this, quote, I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with Little Rocket Man. Then he added, save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done.
The U.S. Air Force preparing to put its nuclear-armed